When discussing the Protestant Reformation, we have already seen the importance of theology for many of the reformers. We spent quite a bit of time looking at Luther's theological concerns about what he saw as the active righteousness being promoted in the Roman Catholic Church. We saw his catchphrase of justification by grace through faith as a way to summarize his primary theological concern at that time in history. We saw Thomas Cranmer in the English Reformation also have concerns about what he and other members of the English church saw as actions and beliefs that got in the way of the more simple message of the sufficiency of Christ's sacrifice for salvation. We saw Luther and Cranmer and others seek to translate the sacred text into local languages to give more people access to the Bible. We saw Calvin and some of his theological concerns and the way in which he grounded them in his own particular systematic framework for understanding the gospel message. But in this video, I want to look at what we can call non-theological factors of the Reformation. And this might be best understood by saying that these are things that help to make the 16th century the right time for the Reformation to be successful. In the Luther video, I mentioned that there had been other earlier attempts at reforming the Catholic Church, at perhaps doing some of the same things that Luther was doing, in the sense of translating scripture, for example, to local languages, and that many of those earlier reform efforts failed. Perhaps they were stopped by the powerful Catholic Church. Perhaps it just wasn't the time to gain popular support. So what was it about the 16th century that made that time ripe for something like the Reformation to actually succeed, to take hold of so much of Europe at the time, and to eventually become a third branch in the Christian faith? So these are the four factors. Again, it doesn't mean that the Reformation necessarily came just because these things were taking place in society. You needed the theology of people like Luther and Thomas Cranmer and Calvin to add to these factors, but these factors may have been very important in allowing those theological and ecclesiological concerns to be successful in forming a new movement that would become Protestantism. So first, we have the political factor. The key here is that in the 16th century, and even a little bit in the 15th century, we're starting to see a real successful push for local political power. Right? Prior to this time, there was a lot of a lack of cohesiveness in many of these territories throughout what had been the western portion of the Roman Empire and areas north of that. And what you see when you get into the 16th century is that local political powers are getting more powerful. Areas are being united under the power of single rulers. When you look even at someone like Henry VIII in England, who is able to garner total control of England and even able to push off advances by those from Scotland or elsewhere, you see this taking shape. When you think of Prince Frederick, a prince in Germany who had the power to be able to actually stand up against the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and the Roman Catholic Church that worked with Charles V, that just shows this shift toward local political autonomy and local political power. And it's hard to really imagine someone like Luther being successful in the way he was without the support of Prince Frederick. And it's hard to imagine Prince Frederick being able to support Luther unless we had seen this shift in the dynamics of political power within the territory at this time in history. So the fact that there's this push for local political power helps to actually shield some of the reformers, actually support some of the reform efforts in the face of what used to be an over-powerful force of the Roman Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire. The second factor is the economic factor. In the 16th century, much of Europe is experiencing great economic growth. What this means is that people feel more financially secure in their local territories. Obviously, this connects back to the rise in political power for local political leaders. With this economic growth, you have the ability for people to perhaps acknowledge that they do not need to be so dependent on centralized power like the Roman Catholic Church or the Holy Roman Empire. And this allows for people to perhaps believe that they can survive a break from the Roman Catholic Church. In earlier centuries, it might have been hard to imagine how people would survive if they broke away from some of those centralized powers. But because we're seeing this push for local political power, partly due to the strength of local economies, it's more possible for a movement like Luther's or Calvin's or Cranmer's to be successful in the 16th century. Third is the social factor. And what we're seeing in the 16th century is a kind of reworking of the social hierarchy. In earlier centuries, the clergy, the religious leaders, were always kind of held high on a pedestal as the most revered class in society. You would never think of challenging those clergy because they were revered so highly. Once we get to the 16th century and the economies are booming, we're seeing a rise in a new merchant class, a kind of business class, the wealthy. And for many people in society, the wealthy now are taking their spot at the highest level of the social hierarchy. And the clergy, the priests, the bishops, the cardinals, in a sense, have kind of been knocked down a few pegs. And what that means is that when someone like Luther comes along and challenges the cardinals, the Pope himself, he is able to get away with that a little bit easier than what earlier reformers would have been able to get away with it. Because on the popular level, people are perhaps less interested in the clergy and more interested in the merchant class. And of course, that continues to this day. How many of us would even recognize important religious leaders if we saw them on the street, versus how many of us would recognize athletes and movie stars and others, those who are wealthy, those who are famous for non-religious reasons. And we see that shift really beginning in the 16th century, which perhaps made it more possible for someone like Luther to challenge religious leaders and to have people actually listen to those challenges rather than just dismissing them, because nobody ever challenges the church. Fourth is what we can call the intellectual factor. And there are actually two parts to the intellectual factor. The first is the invention of the printing press. In earlier centuries, when people tried to do things that were similar to what Luther was doing, if they wanted to get their message out, they would have needed to hand copy pamphlets or tracts or writings. And it was a very laborious process. And usually the Roman Catholic Church, working with the state, could silence people before they were able to get their message out widely. With the invention of the printing press, someone like Luther can mass produce his writings and widely distribute them, so that it is very difficult for the church or the state to get a handle on him before he has become quite popular, and you have movements that are sprouting up throughout Europe seeking some of those reform efforts that we saw with Luther. The second aspect of the intellectual factor in creating a situation that was ripe for the Reformation to be successful is that this is a time period that we know of as the Renaissance. Intellectual historians will give names to different portions of history based on the themes or the emphases that dominated the intellectual world, and by extension, the entire world in given regions. And in Europe, we think of this time in history, maybe 15th, 16th century, as a time of the Renaissance. The Renaissance is kind of building on the heels of the Middle Ages, and the term itself just has to do with a rebirth. And the idea is that people during the Renaissance were interested in returning to the classical sources of Western or European civilization. What that meant is that if you were in the university in the 12th century, for example, back in the Middle Ages, and you wanted to study art, well, you might have been studying a lot of the medieval art that had been sanctioned by the Catholic Church and commissioned by the Catholic Church. It would be the same thing if you were studying literature or philosophy or theology. You would be looking at some of those medieval sources of authority that were part of that time in history. In the Renaissance, once you're up to the 16th century, if you are at the universities and you are studying art, there is this desire to go back and study the art of the Romans, of the Greeks. If you're studying literature, you're not just going to read Dante, you're going to go back and read Homer and Virgil. back to the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans. If you're studying philosophy, you're not just studying Aquinas and Anselm, you're going back and studying the pre-Socratic philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, etc. There is this desire in the intellectual world at this time in history, at this place, to go back to those classical sources of authority. And what that means is that there's kind of at least an implicit, if not explicit, rejection of medieval authority. So when Luther comes along and says what? I do not trust simply in the words of the popes and the councils. That is the medieval sources of authority, the sources of authority for most within the Roman Catholic Church at that time. But instead, I want to go back and elevate the scriptures alone as the ultimate source of authority. What is he doing? He's going back and elevating the classical source of the Christian faith. That way of thinking about the authority for discovering truth and insight makes sense during the time of the Renaissance, when it wouldn't have made as much sense in earlier centuries. So again, with these non-theological factors, these are things that just created that situation that allowed for Luther and Calvin and Cranmer to be a little bit more successful. The fact that everybody was pushing for more local political authority and autonomy meant that you could actually create movements with people who were willing to lead a kind of very clear rebellion against the centralized authority, the Roman Catholic Church, perhaps the Holy Roman Empire, which was trying to still manage control over all of these independent nations that were being formed. Once you have that political autonomy, it's more possible for movements to actually break away. Same thing with the economic growth, which allowed a kind of financial stability and confidence that would have allowed for these breakaway movements. The social changes, very important in allowing people to listen more to challenges brought against religious leaders. And the printing press and the Renaissance, these intellectual factors that are very important in helping to make someone like Luther perhaps more successful than he could have been, despite his theology earlier in time. You still need the theology to really inspire the Protestant movements that are beginning in the 16th century, but you may really have needed these other things to make the theology actually take hold so that the Protestant tradition could truly emerge and thrive.